Okay, so this is the part where I filmed the video over because the last recording failed, and I don't swear. So this was supposed to be, and this is chapters 3, 4, and 5 of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. If you saw my last video where I did chapters 1 and 2, you'll know that I'm working my way through this book a second time. This is a reread for me. I read this as a teenager, and I want to see what more I get out of it a second time, and just kind of work through it slowly and discuss some things. So chapter 3, I've got my notebook here. Chapter 3 for me was the most interesting and perhaps the most important of these 3 chapters. It's called The Crisis in Woman's Identity, and this chapter is pretty much summed up on page 126, and I'm going to read it for you. So Friedan says, the feminine mystique permits, even encourages, women to ignore the question of their identity. The mystique says they can answer the question, who am I, by saying, Tom's wife, Mary's mother. But I don't think the mystique would have such power over American women if they did not fear to face this terrifying blank, which makes them unable to see themselves after 21. The truth is, and how long it has been true, I'm not sure, but it was true in my generation, and it is true of girls growing up today. An American woman no longer has a private image to tell her who she is, or can be, or wants to be. So what Friedan is getting at here is that in the 1940s and the 1950s, young women were not encouraged to develop their identity in the same way that boys were, that men were. Growing up, boys were encouraged to discover themselves, to discover who they were, who they wanted to be, what they wanted to be, and women were not encouraged to discover their identities in the same way, which led, of course, to women kind of sliding into this predetermined role in marriage of mother and wife earlier and earlier in life, because that seemed the logical next step. It seemed the thing to do, but they would slide into this role without knowing who they were. And 3, 4, 5 years down the road into their marriage, they would discover, they would realize that they did not know who they were, that their husband and their children could not fulfill all their needs. Friedan actually uses a great example talking to a room full of college girls. So girls in their late teens, early 20s, a lot of them were engaged, she says, and preparing to get married, quite happy that they were getting married because that was the thing to do, but also a little bit discouraged because that meant giving up the search for an identity, giving up career aspirations. And the women who had that chance, who were not engaged, who had the chance to pursue a career, were also dissatisfied because they felt that they were not fulfilling their feminine role. They were not able to marry, able to have children, as their peers were doing. And Friedan says that essentially the problem is that women's growth was stunted. There is a time, I think, in your late teens and your early 20s where you do need to discover who you are. You need to ultimately develop your identity. You need to choose a path. If you don't have the opportunity to do this, if you don't ultimately discover who you are, who you want to be, where you're going in life, what your role will be, then you never really grow up. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 was interesting, but I don't really have a lot to discuss. In this regard, Chapter 4 is called The Passionate Journey, and it's really Frieden's analysis of the women's rights movement in the United States in the late 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. But Chapter 5 is where it gets interesting. Chapter 5 is called The Sexual Sophisms of Sigmund Freud, and Frieden theorizes that the feminine mystique, which I talked about in a bit of detail in the first video, derived a lot of its power from the psychology of Sigmund Freud. Now, Betty Friedan, a psychologist, very familiar with Freud, and she suggests that at the time she was writing, there was a preoccupation with Freud and his theories, that Freud's opinion, his analysis of women, was being taken too literally. She uses Freud's theories, penis envy, the idea that all of women's discontent has a sexual root. She used Freud's theories in combination with Freud's personal life to ultimately argue that Freud felt women were inferior. She has an interesting quote. Freud saw women as inferior to men, as childlike dolls who existed only in terms of men's love, to love man and to serve his needs. The degradation of women was taken for granted in Freud's theory, Frieden says. And Freud expected women to adjust to society rather than society to adjust to women. And this viewpoint carried into the 1940s into the 1950s because of Freudian psychology, because of its application to life in the United States. And so women in this inferior position were thought of as inferior, and were not encouraged to develop their identities, and thus you have the feminine mystique, this idea that women have the role as mothers, as wives, as kind of a complement to men rather than as an equal. So that is chapters 3 to 5. I'll be doing another video soon. I'm actually going to read some more of it later this morning. It's about 9 a.m. here. If you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section, either on these chapters or on the book as a whole. If there's something vital you think I missed, feel free to tell me, to discuss it, enlighten my other viewers in the comments. And I guess that is it for this video.